All right, it's 1 o'clock. This is the NetConf working group meeting for IETF116. Today is Monday, March the 27th. Along with me, Mahesh and Kent, who's a co-chair, who's attending this remotely because he could not get his passport in time, and Per, who's also attending this meeting remotely. And with me in the front is Shifang. Thank you, Shifang, for being the delegate for this meeting and helping out with the meeting. Next slide, please. This is the note well. Most of you are familiar with it. Basically, by participating in the IETF, you agree to follow the IETF process and policies, details of which can be found in the list of BCPs listed below and on the note well at the bottom. Next slide.
I think you can do it yourself now, Mahesh.
Thanks.
No?
Yeah, let me see which key will enable
Arrow
that.
key.
Okay, I got it. There is a code of conduct that IETF has put together. These are guidelines. In general, IETF relies on the cooperation between participants of diverse backgrounds, and it strives for mutual respect, dignity for all, and common sense, of course, decency. While we do not expect chairs will intervene if necessary to enforce these guidelines. Again, the details can be found in the two links at the bottom. The administrative stuff, let me just quickly go over it. You already know MeetEcho, and you're here either on a client or remotely on a full MeetEcho and attending this meeting. Do watch the chat window for comments, and that, of course, can be made into a separate window. There is a Zulip window also to track any comments. Jabber is, I believe, mirrored on the Zulip link. We have a 2-hour slot, and we will try to put the countdown timer to just help the speakers guide through how much time they have left. And I don't expect we'll have to use to cut off the microphone. We haven't had to till now. The queue, of course, will be managed by MeetEcho. So before you even in the room, do make sure to queue yourself with the hand symbol icon. To speak remotely, use the icon with the play symbol. And of course, remember to remove yourself from the queue. We do appreciate any effort and all the help we can get to contribute to minute taking. You can make it a separate window and put your comments in there. And the link is at the bottom and also in the meeting agenda window. So here's where we are with some of the chartered workgroup items. The HTTP notice of draft is an IESG review. It has received several discussions and comments that primarily I need to go through and work through them. There is an IANA consideration that Rob is helping us work through to figure out where to place some of the IANA root registry. The client server suite of drafts is working through more post last call comments and now some AD review comments. The UDP note of draft is work in progress, is going to be discussed in this meeting, and so is the distributed note of draft. The Adaptive subscription draft is, of course, an experimental work in progress, is not being discussed in this meeting. TLS 1.3 is post last call comments and is being discussed in this meeting. And finally, the two new drafts, both list pagination and transaction ID drafts, are work in progress and will be discussed. We have a fairly packed agenda. We have Alex presenting both the UDP and the distributed notif drafts. Per will talk to us about the list pagination drafts. And Sean here will talk about NetConf over TLS, which I guess he'll also mention that he has renamed the draft. The final set of uncharted items include transaction ID and tracing mechanisms. So this is a combination of three drafts, and with an overview of how some of the transaction ID drafts relate to each other, hopefully. So we'll get to hear that from a combination of three authors. In the non-charted items, we do have NetConf private candidates from James, Yang model for NetConf event notification from Alex, and support for versioning and Yang notification from Thomas Graff. And Thomas continues with two more presentations on host name and sequencing and Yang notifications and network observation timing. Finally, Chin has decided to present an incident management for network services. All right, that's as far as the chair slides are concerned. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Qiu Fang. And just a quick question is, I'd like to know that if the working group has any plan to initiate the NetConf or ResConf next work, because we already have the client server suite of drafts, which is going to pass the working group last call. So I think that maybe more time and energy could be freed up by the working group. So just want to know any comments about that?
Hey, this is Kent as a contributor. The first step to that probably will be to initiate work on Yang next in NetMod working group. And then there will be a trickle down effect into the NetConf working group on the ResConf next and NetConf next drafts. I think the NetConf working group could make some progress in those drafts even before then, but it wouldn't make sense to try to publish anything until then.
And I was going to go and ask what is some of the work that Shifang had in mind as of interest from a NetConf Next perspective?
I think that we already have some work like the pagination and the transaction ID and the private candidate work is already being discussed now, but there are also some other issues maintained on the NetConf or ResConf Next GitHub page, something like the binary encoding of a binary notif and some other issues. Some of may need a NetConf based work, and I just like to know if it's time to discuss some of them.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yes, Kent. I think this is a good suggestion, long overdue, but I want to remind the work group that it's a volunteer effort, and so if there's anyone that's looking for an interesting draft to work on, there are a number of items that have been cataloged, issues tracked, or in the NetConf Next and ResConf Next issue trackers, and looking at those, picking one up, and moving it forward in the working group would be much appreciated.
To that, I would add that actually some of the work doesn't even necessarily require us to move to NetConf next per se. Things like binary encoding work can be still brought forth without a whole new NetConf protocol. All right. First step, UDP notif and configured subscriptions.
Hello. Yeah. So this is Alex from InstaLeon on behalf of the authors. I'd like to present an update on UDP notif. So next slide, please. So what I wanted to discuss is the changes we have done between the last two iterations, and maybe at the end, since the authors feel that this draft is already stable and did not receive any new feedback, maybe asking for a working group last call. Next. So we have received some feedback that the observation domain ID and the message ID from the draft was not really clarified. So that's so we clarified these two definitions. First, that to maintain the observation domain ID unicity. If this observation domain ID is not unique across the collection domain, the source IP should be used to preserve the unicity of the UDP notif message. And then the second thing, we also received some feedback that the message ID sequence was not clear. So we clarified in the draft that this message ID sequence is per observation domain ID and not per subscription. We also have received some feedback from Benoit and Rob Wilton saying that the observation domain ID name should be changed to not confuse it with the IPFix definition. We have looked into that, but changing just the name of on this draft impacts greatly on the distributed notif, which is centered around this concept of observation domain and observation domain ID. That's why we, the authors, decided to not change it. And to fix this issue, what we did is remove all the IPFix references from this observation domain ID term. And we are defining the observation domain and observation domain ID in the distributed notif drafts. And in this definition, there is no reference to IPFix, and therefore it is in the scope of young push. Hope this works. Yeah.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I think my, as a participant, my question is what's the actual definitions in this draft? What do they look like compared to how these are defined in IPFix? Ben will probably know the answer to this. If we still using the same names but have different definitions, are we still going to cause confusion between people who are using this in IPFix, even if we've defined them differently here? Or if they're semantically equivalent, then I'm not sure there's any issue. So I don't know if you know the answer to that, Benoit. Okay, thank you.
I cannot answer that, but as far as I know, the definitions are pretty the same. But as far as I understood from your feedback is that we want to separate the concepts from IPFix and young push.
But I thought when we were discussing it was because the definitions were different between the two. So I think that was why the concern came up, but I may have misremembered the conversation, or I may not have understood the conversation.
Okay, I have to review that.
All right. Mahesh, as contributor, I just wanted to, I did notice that you have a grouping that you did make out for UDP, what I call UDP transport parameters. But looking at the TCP client server suite of draft and their definition of grouping that Kent has come up with, would it make sense to have a similar grouping for UDP also? UDP client server grouping that generally can be used by other drafts?
Sorry, I don't
Okay,
follow.
if you look at TCP client server
Mhm.
draft that Kent has put together, you'll notice that he has two groupings, TCP client and TCP server.
Yeah.
And you'll notice some of the transport parameters are similar to what UDP has.
Yes.
It would be helpful and for reusability, from a reusability perspective, to have something similar for UDP.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm more than happy to walk you through what I
Okay.
see.
I'd love that.
And I would love to see similar groupings being defined in your UDP notif draft, possibly.
Okay.
Or maybe a separate draft. That's up to you.
Okay.
It would be good to have a grouping.
Okay. Let's look into that.
Benoit Claes. So I'm slightly confused by this open issue. I don't recall exactly why I mentioned that, but I have a high-level question. So in IPFix, we've got the notion of observation domain ID. Typically, this is a line card and router in which you got the caching exporting. Is the high-level point that for Yang push, if you got this observation ID, which is used for IPFix, you would use the same value if it's sent from a line card? This is a high-level goal or not?
No, as far as I understood, the observation domain ID is the exporter process, but I don't expect to be the same as the IPFix one.
Okay, thank you.
So next slide, please. Some other changes that has been made to this last iteration. We added the phrase that message with unordered options may be dropped by the collector, and other big changes on the YAM module as decided on the last IETF in London. The address leaf has been changed to IP address no zone. And now we are following the HTTPS notif structure to configure UDP notif. And changing that, we also changed the prefix to UNT, standing for UDP notif transport, to be more consistent and more explicit. And then at the end of the draft, we added 3 examples, not normative examples. One on how to configure UDP notif without DTLS encryption, one with DTLS, and then lastly, one example on how a JSON message could be encoded on using this UDP notif transport. Next, please. So these are the changes that has been made. We did not receive any feedback from the mailing list. I would love to review the grouping issue with Maesh. So apart from this issue, I would love to, if there is no more issues, maybe consider the working group last call at some point.
All right, if there are no questions, then I guess maybe one more revision of the draft before we bring up the question of last call.
Then next one, go.
Yeah, hi, it's Ken. I'm just saying, definitely would need another revision if we're going to try to incorporate a UDP client server base layer.
Okay. So also on behalf of the authors, I wanted to give an update on the distributed notif draft. Next slide, please. So here really few changes, some editorial changes. The requirement language has been updated. And we also understood that from the implementation that the observation domain ID is actually an unsigned integer. And from the YANG module, it was defined as a string. So we corrected that. And that's actually the only change we did. So next slide. Here, the same distributed notif is really bound to the UDP notif. So we would like to the same once all the issues has been addressed on the UDP notif, asking for a working group last call at the same time. And that would be all if there is no any new feedback.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Per.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So, yeah, my name is Per, and I'm going to present the list pagination mechanisms for YANG-driven protocols and defined in NetConf or for RESTconf and NetConf. Next slide, please.
If you use your arrow keys, it should be able to come up.
All right, okay, I can drive it myself. Okay, so sweet overview of the list pagination. It's for YANG-driven protocols and defined as 0.1 revision. It's a standard mechanism to control the filtering and retrieval of entries, of lists or leaf lists. And there are currently protocol support in NetConf and RESTconf. So the current status is that we have added cursor pagination, and that has been published. There are some editorial details left that needs to be addressed. There was also a few questions raised last meeting in London about cursor-based pagination without snapshots, if we should add support for paginating a snapshot of the data store or indicating a snapshot or not. And also a question was raised about locale-based sorting. So the cursor-based pagination is an opaque cursor to an entry in the list. And it would look like this. It would go into the attributes of the list and have previous and next cursors as well. So it would supply a query parameter. It would be a cursor. Could combine it with a limit, and then you have the previous and next pointers to the next page for consumption. So snapshot pagination then would take a snapshot of the query data store and then traverse that snapshot. It can be very costly, of course. So the document doesn't mention if pagination snapshots are used or not, if the data in the underlying data store is snapshotted. And it could be left up to the implementer. And depending on the use case, just traversing the data influx is a usable best effort solution. The draft already mentions the system capabilities to constrain huge lists. So that could be used to disable pagination for certain lists. So the question is that enough, or should it perhaps be indicated in some way that the pagination is a snapshot or not. So I would like to raise a poll if it should be documented further. I don't know if I get help with raising the poll or if I do it myself.
If you have the capability, you can. If you can't, then I
So,
can run it for you.
You may very well help me. I think that's faster. Should have practiced this.
Okay, ending it now. I think we had an equal break, pretty much an even break between the two.
Okay.
But it was also low participation, possibly because not enough people understand the solution.
Okay. So there is no real solution, but my suggestion is that we could show through an attribute perhaps to if the data is a snapshot from the underlying database or not. So is the poll closed? If so, let's just carry on and we'll see. I can also take it to the list and clarify the suggestion there.
Yes, I would definitely suggest you take it to the list.
Yeah. Okay. So next question that was raised on IETF 115 in London was locale-based sorting. So we have not worked on it and nothing is published in the draft then, of course. So I would like to raise another poll if we should look into locale-based sorting further.
Describe what you mean. What was the? Can you just capture quickly what it was?
So the question raised at the last meeting was pretty. It was pretty. Didn't give much info to the authors, I believe, but as I understood it, different locales, of course, sort differently. So if we should support maybe supplying a locale that you want to use when sorting, and maybe reporting what locale was used when sorting. That was my understanding.
Concrete example.
So when you give sort by, for instance, you also supply sort by locale that you want to use when sorting.
I'm sorry, can you give a concrete example, a specific field that for which the locale would matter?
I am by no means expert in locales, but I would guess that the Swedish characters å, ä, and ö would be sorted differently in the Swedish locale and in the English US locale, for instance. And both these locales might not know about how to sort Japanese at all. a proper way.
Okay. I'll start the poll.
And that was also what Balazs said in the chat.
Kent, I'll let you end the poll this time.
I did. Pretty convincing that we, as work group, is not interested.
Okay. Good to have that answered. Let's continue. Yeah, that is it. Questions?
Can I just make a, sorry, I was just going to make a comment on this one. It's Rob Wilton. I think I was still struggling to see the real use case of this. So I think it might be useful, but I don't see what the use case is, or in the mainline case, I imagine this probably doesn't matter. So I think the understanding really where it helps and what use cases and whether it matters would be quite beneficial.
I would agree with Rob. It was more my lack of understanding of exactly the problem statement that kind of made me answer a no to the poll. So maybe a more concrete example, especially how useful it would be, might be something we can take to the mailing list and discuss before we actually decide it's not something we want to pursue.
Absolutely. I'll formulate something and take it to the list as well.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sean Turner. So this version of the draft is basically trying to address working group last call comments. And you'll note that I renamed the draft based on a comment. I'm going to get to that in a second, though. So next slide, please. And it is the only slide. So what are the changes? We got some minor editorial corrections that were suggested. So we made some PRs and threw those in there. By the way, each one of those is links if you want to click on that and you can go see what the actual changes were. We did have a note in one of the sections that was asked about some cipher suites, and it was kind of colloquial type text, and it didn't really belong in there, but it kind of worked because during working group last call, we basically got comments to remove it. So we figured there was no action required to just get it out of there. One of the things that happened was we were referencing 7325 bis, and it was actually published as an RFC, a BCP actually. So we updated that reference there. We had an empty acknowledgement section. Well, we got a bunch of working group last call comments, so we thanked all the people there. And the last one was really kind of the big change, which was, hey, you know, this document really ought to update RFC 7589. So that basically led to a bunch of things that we had to change, which was the title, because it was just NetConf over TLS 1.3, but you know, to update RFC 7589, you really had to say something about TLS 1.2. And what you're going to do with TLS 1.3 and whether you do one or the other. And luckily, RFC 9325 already told us what to do, which was you're fine to keep doing TLS 1.2 if you want. If you support TLS 1.3, do that one instead. Kind of like it kind of laid out what to do. But to get it to do the updates, we had to update it, add the updates header. We provided some recommendations about cipher suites as well, because the cipher suite that's in there for TLS 1.2 in the base document will not get through the ISG. There's no way that the cipher suite that was specified in 2014 would make it. So we made it the cipher suite that is as close as possible to it, which is the one that's listed up there. And we did a little reworking of some security considerations where the text there was kind of like, hey, please go review this. We kind of made it more prescriptive where it says, the security considerations of the RFCs X, Y, and Z apply. So go read those. So we addressed all the known outstanding comments during working group last call. We pushed a new version, and I believe that we are ready to progress to the AD. Does anyone else have any other things that maybe we missed or doesn't like the way we resolved any of them? I really think the last one is kind of the big one, is the update to the 7589 is really kind of the one that's really worth looking at to make sure that it's done properly and people agree with the recommendations essentially. Going once. Going twice.
All right. So the comment from the chair says that I think since the document is already post last call, and since there are no objections here, and we'll probably watch the mailing list for a couple of days.
Yeah.
But if not, then I see no reason why we might not take it up.
Yeah. So the only question is whether you think you should run another working group last call, because we did change the title, and I would argue that the last one was kind of a big scope change.
All right. Point taken. So maybe a shorter last call?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you, 2 weeks, whatever. I'm not really kind of burning down the house to get this one pumped out the door, so.
Okay.
Yeah, all right.
I'll be happy.
I was just going to make the comment, Bob Wilton, that given I've got a large queue of documents for this working group, it's not making a difference time-wise. So if you want to do belt and braces and do another 2 weeks, then
yeah, it's fine. And then I guess the other thing I would like to note is that there is a discussion that's going to happen in TLS 1.2 and the TLS working group about actually deprecating TLS 1.2 in its entirety, which will have kind of massive implications. So if you're interested in that, you can come to the session and join the festivities. But yeah, again, like we're not really in any big hurry, so 2 weeks is fine. All right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Actually, can you put the other presentation, the one about the external transaction ID?
Okay, Kent, there's a request to put Jean's, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, very good.
Jean's presentation up first.
Exactly.
Got the wrong one.
Okay, so I will be presenting first the update on no, it's the other presentation, sorry. It's the one that is called external transaction ID or something like this. But, okay, so yeah, no problem. So I will be presenting first the update on the slide, which was based on the transaction ID. Yes, this one. So the external transaction ID for configuration tracing. And there was another proposition to do configuration tracing from Jan and Roque. And so basically, I will start with going over the update for this one, which I think will go fast, and then explain how we could converge and make all these drafts work together. So next slide, please. No, it's not. Yeah. So just to recap quickly the use case, if we have several orchestrator controllers and network elements, they can be configured we can have one orchestrator configuring a given network element indirectly. And the idea is that whenever there is a change that we manage to identify as a problematic change, let's say in a network element, we want to be able to trace it back to a change in an orchestrator or in a controller. So this is the motivation for this work. So next slide, please. So this is the recap quickly of what we put in the first version. So basically, to give the little bit more context. So the idea is that we have a Yang module which basically maps whatever local identification of a configuration change we have to either the transaction that caused this change or the transaction that were triggered because of this change of local configuration, or both if it's something that is in the middle that is triggered and then triggers something. And so if we have this mapping between the transaction from the parent and the transaction to the children, then we are able to recursively go back to the top transaction. That was the main idea. Next slide, please. So the changes were mainly like cosmetic clarifying changes. So changing basically northbound to parent and southbound to child. So next slide, please. Also clarifying the fact that we have this client ID and that it's not really the scope of this draft to explain how we get the client ID, but we need to have a kind of client ID. It should be part of some kind of inventory. Next slide, please. And so this is the interesting part, actually, to explain how we can converge with actually the other draft. And actually, the proposition is to kind of not throw away, but instead of using the transaction ID, using this notion of trace ID from the W3C trace context, as suggested in the trace context extension draft. And the reason for that is that it simplifies a lot our model, because now we don't have to take care of a northbound transaction and the southbound transaction. We just have the trace ID, which would be the same for all the things initiated by a given starting point. So if it's the orchestrator, it's the orchestrator. If it's the collector, it's the collector. But then all the subsequent transactions would have the same trace ID. So this is basically the way to simplify the thing. So here there is a parent ID that we could use as a client ID, but actually we can't, because it's not the same among the several transitions. It's just valid in the context of a given trace. So a way to obtain the client ID, to pass the client ID, would be to either encode it in the trace state, which is another part of the trace parent. Not the trace parent, it's another part of the headers that we can pass through the W3C trace context, or to get it in another way. So basically, the suggestion to move ahead with this draft is to actually switch from the transaction ID to the trace context, to the trace ID. So next slide, please. I think this one we can skip it. Next slide, please. So on the open question, actually, getting the trace ID simplifies some questions, the ones that are stricken down. The trace ID should be unique, so no more collision risk. And for the protocol, well, the trace context supports RESTconf, so that's already covered. And so the remaining open question is, well, I mean, I think it makes sense for me to switch to the trace ID. So basically, I'm working on the next version of the draft, which will be much simpler with the trace ID. And the next remaining open question is, how do we pass the client ID? It's not really how to get the client ID, but it's how to pass it. So this is the next open question for me. So any questions? Kent?
The contributor. I see at the bottom of the slide, trace ID context approach can be used with RESTconf as well. So is this the plan, or is it still a question?
No, it's just it's something that is based on HTTP headers. So RESTconf being HTTP, it's just some headers that you can add, so it works with RESTconf.
Go ahead, Ro.
So yeah, I think it's just the last slide. Sorry.
Go ahead, Ro.
Yeah. So no. Yeah. So you mentioned another metadata. I just want to mention that, as we said in the next slide, in the next presentation, W3C has defined somewhere that it may be better for what you want to transmit. That's called baggage. We didn't introduce that yet because we didn't want to do. We put it as a next step that we are working on also. Maybe that's a better place rather than the trace state, because the trace state refers to specific information that is relevant for the OTLP receiver. Baggage, it may be a better metadata place to actually transmit these items. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so basically, I think this is all for me.
All right, I don't see anyone in the queue. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Jean, for that introduction. So this is what you just heard is related to this, and I'll start here with some updates to a few more drafts, and then at the end we'll give this sort of overview of how they all fit together. So bear with me for a moment. I'll start first with this draft IETF-NETCONF transaction ID 00. It was adopted, so that's why it looks like it 00 here, even though it's had a few runs in here already. There was primarily one big thing that happened in this iteration, and there was some additional logic around how transaction IDs are handled in the candidate data store, and I'll show you that on the next slide. And also there was some description in the previous version about how copy config works, but then we realized that actually we can use the same logic as we do for edit config for that. So there was a slight change to how copy config works then. And there were also another corner case identified with transaction IDs in relation to when dependencies and default values. That was a bit unclear. So we added some description of how that works. Other than that, there's some security considerations. There was another example of how Young push works added to the draft, and some more details about error info, and then some rewording and clarifications based on the feedback that we got on the mailing list earlier. This transaction ID with candidate data store behavior change is that, okay, let's consider a case where we have a get config towards the candidate data store, where the most recent transaction ID that was in there was 3456. But when you are reading from the candidate data store, you may have elements in there that have changed versus running, but are not committed yet. So the question was, okay, so what sort of transaction ID do you report for such changed items that are not committed? And we decided that two answers are possible for that. Either you have a mechanism that can foresee what the transaction ID would be for those elements in the future, and then you can return that value. Or most implementations maybe might not know what the transaction ID will be in the future, and they can return this special value ! So that's what we added. So the next steps for this particular draft is then we think we need some more implementation experience, and we'll be driving that on our own end, of course. But I definitely invite other implementers of NetConf servers to consider implementing some of this, at least take a good look at how they would implement it. So if there is any feedback from implementers, that'd be most welcome. Then we have the traced context extension. That's the one that Jean was talking about earlier. And Rocky, would you like to take this one? You have to unmute, I'm afraid.
All right. Next slide, please. All right. So we actually published 2 versions since our last meeting. We did a number of editorial changes and also some substantial changes. The first editorial change is based on the to clarify and to document the connection with the previous draft that was presented here. We added an example where actually trace information can be stored in a Young data store, and that emphasized the complementary nature of the different drafts. We also added a new use case, things like billing and auditing, also more to give more context on this information. And but going to the substance, what we've done is complete some of the to-do that we had since the 0.0 version. In particular, the error handling section, which is almost complete. We are missing some more work there. And one of the things we wanted to make NetConf maybe better than the HTTP protocols is to add a way that where EW3C changes the version of the their encoding of these headers, we can actually have a dynamic way between NetConf client and service to be able to understand and share those capabilities. So we do have a very small Young model that can be shared in the Young library. So either via NetConf or RESTConf, you can understand which versions of the W3C standards are supported by the server. To that, we had to add also the Young model names for IANA consideration. So these were the changes, and then we also, as we say, we work a lot on to facilitate this complementary. So going to the next slide, remember that what we are trying to define in this document is decorating every RPC, not just edit config, which was the case before, with actually information or metadata that is actually sent between the all the different components I may be talking, in particular in NetConf. This is this draft, but it can be also done in RESTConf. And the idea is that this data then can be used by either the orchestrator, the controllers, or the network elements when they go and export OTLP, which is a new protocol being decided by the Cloud Native Foundation, to external collectors. So one of the key elements of using the W3C encoding is to tap into the ecosystem of collector traces and logs that exist. There are a lot of commercial and open source tools that are embracing these standards, and we have some screenshots to show you on a pre-draft implementation that we have done already. So in concrete, what we're trying to do, what we are asking here, the working group, is to basically a modification of the NetConf standard, where we are adding 2 new extensions that you see there, the W3C, PEC, trace state and trace parent, and we are adopting the exact same format as the W3C that allow us to be compatible between NetConf and RESTConf, because RESTConf has an HTTP-based protocol. W3C has already defined that, and that will help a lot in the implementation case. So next slide, please. And one of the key things that we're saying is that initially, actually, this idea of creating and sharing the tracing for context information between NetConf client and servers was originally part of the transaction ID draft, the individual contributor draft, but only for the configuration. But then that was dropped. But in the meantime, actually, this idea, as we say, was further developed by W3C, only for HTTP and other protocols, and include all the operations, any get, put, patch, post, delete. That's why in NetConf we translate that to any RPC. And of course, there's a lot of backend vendors that are actually embracing all of these concepts. Now, that integration with the mainstream tool is very important because at the end, when you are managing NetConf-based environment, you want to reuse the tools that you're using to manage any other application. Okay, next slide. So just to give you, this is exactly an example. So we took basically an orchestrator and a controller. Both of them are sharing trace context information. Actually, both of them are the same implementation. And what we do is this controller and orchestrator can export information using the OTLP protocol to this commercially available tool. So we set up a test user in a tool called Lightstep from the company ServiceNow. And you can see that in the same screen, while you are troubleshooting your issues, you have the orchestrator traces and the controller traces. This is a netconf edit config. And every single trace here share the same trace ID. So, no need for machine learning. Just actually, you can correlate things very easily because every span and every single action that the orchestrator and the controller are doing is using the same trace ID. So next slide. One of the things to further clarify the objective here is actually W3C is also keeping a registry of every single protocol that is actually exporting or sharing trace context information. So basically the idea, just like they have done it for HTTP, for IMQP or MQTT, is to add RESTconf and NetConf to this list of protocols. So next steps, basically there's a little bit of work on error handling. We do have also other documents that are complementary to what we're doing, but we just didn't want to introduce too many things to the working group. One of them is the RESTconf part. It's very simple. It's just to say that the header should be implemented. And as I mentioned in the previous comment, there's a baggage idea also in the W3C that could be useful, and we just saw in the previous presentation that could be the case. And yeah, I'm finding out the process to register maybe the NetConf or RESTconf to this W3C registration list. Okay, so with that, leave the mic to you, Jean, again to discuss the complementary of the documents now.
Perfect, thank you. Right on time. So just to, if you haven't been following this very closely, there's probably a lot of different drafts and it's unclear exactly how they relate to each other. So let me try to give you a little bit of overview of that. So we are talking about 5 different drafts that are in the same area. We have this transaction ID, which is now an IETF adopted one with 00. We have the configuration trace one that you had from Jean earlier. We had the W3C trace one that we heard about now. We have the PrivCand one that's coming right after my presentation here. And we have the e-tags in RC84 that's RESTconf since earlier. And if you look at the sort of use cases that are mentioned in these drafts on the left here, you can see there's a fairly massive overlap between the use cases that they are relevant in. There are some dependencies between these drafts also that where one assumes that some other draft will take care of it. And there are some, for the PrivCand case, the paint is not dry yet, so we will see exactly how it will develop. So this looks like a massive overlap. How do we solve this? But when you actually read those drafts, you will see that actually the functionality that is specified is not overlapping that much. So there is a good chance that all of these could be made into a coherent framework. The problem right now is perhaps that while they are sometimes referring to each other, the definitions of terms and mechanisms are not done in a coherent way right now. So we need to work on how they should relate to each other in a more consistent fashion. so that we get one set of terms and mechanisms. And let me try to animate this for you. So here's a sort of picture taken from one of these drafts, Jean's draft actually, where you have the orchestrator, you have the controllers, and you have some network elements on the bottom. And if you look at what the private candidate draft is doing, it's defining how a network element can have private candidates for different managers, like controller 1 and 2 have their separate private candidates in NE2. And that is quite useful in those cases. It's not strictly necessary. You can use locking and stuff like that to lock the shared candidate to get around it, but then you get lower performance and some complications. But this is a nice addition. Then we have this draft transaction ID, which is adding a sort of local transaction ID in every NetConf server, and that those transaction IDs are also communicated back to the client that sits on the north of this device, of this server. So that's the yellow parts here. And what we talked about now in this transaction context, it's adding a way to spread a transaction ID from the top, going trickle down to all the participating devices. So that's the part in green, and then report it back into some sort of MELT processor. And what Jean's draft is adding is also a way to expose all of these IDs in a Yang model, if you like. And this MELT processor could either use OTLP protocol or any other method to access all this information, or it could use this Yang mapping, transaction ID mapping if it wants to. So there's basically 4 different complementary mechanisms that are building up a solution, in my opinion. And what I would like to see then is that we design these 4 documents into a coherent framework, where each of these 4 documents are optional to implement and optional to use. I think that's a good chance. They don't depend on each other in such a way that you would be forced to use. They are providing good things for this puzzle, but they are actually independently implementable and usable. And what I'd like then to see that we take these use cases, the terminology, and align the behavior. And if that can happen in these 4 drafts as a standalone documents, or if you need a 5th document that defines the use cases, terminology, and behavior, and then everybody refers back to that, is something that I don't know right now. I'm open to both solutions. But I think we need to align these 4 documents in order for things to be working well. And that was all I had. Rob, please.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I think it sounds to me like trying to line these together is a good idea. So I think that's nice if we can get solutions that all work together. The one comment in terms of, do you need a framework document or overview document? I would generally try and avoid those if you can, so you can get away with just getting the 4 drafts and seeing those fit together. Do those first, and then if you need something else to bring them together, then write a 5th document. But hopefully they can have enough text within them to actually maybe some informative text to say you can also use it with this one in this way or something, without necessarily having an overview document. But that's just an opinion. So
I agree totally with that opinion, but I wanted to give myself some negotiation space here.
Very sensible.
All right. Again, just an opinion. I was actually thinking that maybe an architecture document that kind of describes the relationship between all of them would be helpful. But again, you can choose to either wait till you have synchronized the terms before you get to that, or think about maybe starting the 5th draft.
Very good. Thank you.
And once again, I was just thinking of the packaging work where we'd started off with like a problem statement definition and then an overview of the solution. But I think going forward, we'd sort of lost those in the process and we're trying not to have it. We just sort of copied some of the base spec. The difference with that is those drafts sort of build on each other more, whereas I think these sort of sit as a set that complement. So it is slightly different. But I'm not wedded to any particular solution here.
Kent is a contributor. In between the two ideas that we put forward, looking at the client-server suite of drafts, each of those drafts have a preamble that regard like a 3 or 4 paragraphs that describe how that draft is related to the suite of drafts.
Excellent. I think that would be the ideal.
Benoit Claes, regarding architecture document or not, actually I don't care too much, but what we don't want to do is fall in the trap that we need to have the architecture before doing all the other works. So actually I'm in favor if we don't need it, that's even better. Now, if after the fact, whenever you got the full solution, you want to explain an overview or whatever, this is perfectly fine.
Thank you.
All right. No other comments? I guess we can move to the next presentation. Oh, sorry, Kent.
Yes, Kent, but I'm reading from the queue, and Mohammed wrote that I think it makes sense to have one framework doc, but keep the solution IDs separate. The framework is helpful for those who will use the functionality.
Excellent feedback. Thank you.
So hi there, James Cumming on behalf of the authors for the private candidates draft. The 01 version hasn't been published. We had some personal reasons that the authors haven't been able to get together and publish these yet, but they will come soon. So but just wanted to give you an overview of the draft, remind you it's still here and tell you what's coming. So as a quick overview for those who don't know, this is proposing a definition of what a private candidate is and how you interact with it over NetConf. So the idea being that you can send configuration changes without locking your individual data store. So multiple clients can make configuration changes in parallel to speed up performance. Particularly useful where clients are generally making changes to different sections of the configuration. So there's no need for them to interact with each other. So we go to the next slide. So the version 1 I was mentioned is coming. We discussed, there was a comment last meeting about whether we should create like a problem statement overview draft, and then how it applies to NetConf and how it applies to RESTconf as separate drafts. I think the authors would prefer to leave it in a combined draft for private candidates over NetConf. We kind of feel the approach is more directly related to NetConf than RESTconf, but we're open to kind of some more feedback on that. And obviously, if someone feels strongly, then we need to do that split. And we would definitely need help on the RESTconf side if we were going to do that. So a volunteer would be useful. And next slide.
Just can you clarify that last statement? Yeah, can you clarify that last statement about private candidate discourse being more directly relevant to NetConf more so than RESTconf?
Yeah, so we were trying to look at how this the transactions that you're making against the private candidates operate in both fields. And as I mentioned at the last meeting, neither of us on the author side are particular experts in RESTconf here. So yeah, we're definitely open for more info. But we felt that the draft itself was pretty directly related to NetConf in terms of the updates to all of the relevant operations, etc. But again, yeah, if we need to revisit that, then we're more than happy to do so and would look for some assistance.
As far as I can tell, the idea would equally well apply to RESTConf, and maybe it makes sense to do a poll on that, unless anyone else has an opinion.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we can certainly do that if someone wants to set up a poll as to whether we should look at splitting this out into a kind of a definitions draft of what is a private candidate, and then an implementation in NetConf and RESTConf. We'd need to look at where conflicts would occur and which drafts they'd fall into. But maybe that's a quick poll we can do. I don't know how quickly that is to set up.
I'm sorry, just, my comment wasn't so much whether or not we should split it out into separate documents or how many documents, but whether or not we should support RESTConf at all.
Okay. So maybe that's a simpler poll then. Should we, as a working group in terms of this draft, be looking at RESTConf at all?
Ken, do you want to start a poll for that, or you want me to? Okay, I guess he's typing it.
Meeting it, Mesh. So it's about a 60-40 split. Thank you.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So I was trying to click both options, which obviously doesn't work, and I was trying to unclick my second option, which also doesn't work. So I think this is definitely worth considering, the impact of RESTConf. So I don't think we should dismiss it out of hand, especially with like the NMDA architecture. That brings sort of RESTConf much closer to NetConf in terms of having data stores. So in that sense, maybe it does make sense to do it in NetConf as well. Sorry, RESTConf as well. However, RESTConf's also meant to be an easier protocol to use and simpler protocol, so then maybe it doesn't make sense. So I think it's from that angle. I don't know the answer here, or I don't have a good feel for the answer is. I think it's worth keeping that open at this stage. I don't think you have to necessarily solve the RESTConf bit now. I think you could tackle that later. The other comment in terms of drafts, I would suggest you keep it all together initially, and then later on, if you need to split it out, that's relatively easy. But in terms of processing and reviewing and things like that, having it in one document, because it wouldn't be that long, I would suggest going that direction.
Okay, good feedback. Thanks, Rob. All right, so sorry, next slide then. Okay, so some of the work that is coming imminently, we're changing the focus to be the initial version of the draft was almost a problem statement type draft. It's definitely focusing a lot more now on the definitions and the proposed solutions. So we've provided some good examples of what are conflicts and some graphical representations to help with the concept of branching out different candidates. And then we'd spent some time focusing on the different resolution methods and how they would react with some examples, so that you can get a bit clearer of an idea about how we deal with resolution, as that was one of the big pieces that I think is a major focus here, is having identified what is a conflict and how you then resolve it. So you'll see the details when we do the version 1. I don't want to preempt the authors prior to release. So, and then I think there's one very quick slide. So yeah, the version 1's coming. The framework discussion we just had actually from Jan. I think this one was originally going to go before Jan, so that's why it's in there. And then after we've got a 0-1 and had some more time on the list, we'll then consider working group adoption for it. That's it.
All right, we have no one in the queue.
Hello, just for the.
Yeah, stay here.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, yeah. Just for the record, I will be presenting also on behalf of Alex on the first draft. And before I start, I've been giving at the IPG already a presentation to give an overview about, let's say, the motivation and use cases. So these slides I put at the end of the slide deck could be interesting for NetConf as well. And I just focusing on 3 initial slides to give it a little bit an overview of all the different extensions we are doing now in the NetConf notification header and also in the Yang push header. Next slide, please. So when we are looking at NetConf currently in this area, basically we are working on the transport protocol where we are defining HTTPS node-diff and UDP node-diff. We have the metadata part, which I will be describing now in the several drafts we have here. And we have the semantic versioning in the Yang model versioning draft in NetMod. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overall picture, so at the end, what we're trying to solve here is we have basically NetConf as the API for the configuration towards the network. And we have Yang push being basically pushing the operational metrics from the network. And what we're trying to achieve is to have, we have the Yang data store on the network device, and we want to have a Yang data store in data mesh in big data. So that at the end, it's basically just a synchronization process between the two. Next slide, please. So data mesh is a big data architecture, so where different domain can exchange freely data with the so-called bounded context and have SLOs defined for data products. So we have clear specified interfaces between those different domains, those different teams. Semantics are obviously needed, so that, for instance, we can describe the difference between an integer, gauche, or a counter. So at the end, when we are visualizing the data, we know that for a counter, we have to perform a counter normalization. Versioning is needed in case of when semantics are changing. We need to understand whether those changes are backward compatible or not. So with this, we can actually prevent breaking the end-to-end data processing pipeline. And last but not least, we need also to understand in order to perform SLOs on the data product. So in order to measure loss and delay for that data, we need to identify from where the data is actually coming from. And we also need the proper timestamping. So we need the host name, the publisher ID, sequence numbers to detect the loss, and also the observation timestamping when the network metrics were being observed on the network. And this is what I will be showing in the next slides. Next slide, please. So starting with the NetConf notifications draft. So in RFC 5277, the XML schema for the NetConf notification header was being defined. What's missing today is that we have also a Yang model for it. This is what this draft is addressing. So that enables us at the end that the Yang push message can be now completely, the semantics can be defined for the entire message now, including the notification header. Next slide, please. This draft has already been shown at the last IETF 115. In between, we made some modifications. the model prefix has changed to iNotif to be more explicit. The namespace has been changed to the same as being defined in RFC 5277. And the INER section, instead of asking for a new URI, we ask that this document is being added as reference instead. And we are asking the NetConf working group for adoption. We believe we should move forward with this document fairly quickly, since this is one of the gaps of, we believe, of RFC 8639 and 8641, because there is not yet a young model being defined, and we are not adding any additional definitions here. Next slide, please. Coming to the next draft, to the NetConf notification sequencing. Here we are adding 3 new, besides the existing event time, we are adding 3 additional fields. So sysname is basically defining from which network device this matrix or this notification message has been exposed from. The publisher ID is identifying which publisher process is exposing this metric. So, and the last but not least is the sequence number, so that we are able to recognize loss end-to-end across both these messaging systems. Yeah. Next slide, please. So the observation timestamping is an extension on the subscription state change notification messages. It is an extension on the push update. There for the 2 different subscriptions, for the periodical and the on-change subscription. So we are adding 2 additional fields called observation time and state change observation time, while the observation time is the field where basically it contains the timestamp when the metric was being pulled from the Yangs data store, while the state changed observation time is on the on-change subscription, the moment where the state change occurred in the network, while in case of on-change sync on start subscriptions, if that change in the network happened before the subscription was being established, then it's the initial state change happened in the network and not the moment when we established the subscription, just to be explicit there. And the main motivation is to add the observation timestamping is currently we already have an event timestamping on the notification header. Do not mistake, there are differences between the 2. So the event timestamping describes when the notification message has been sent from the publisher process, while the observation timestamps refer to when the network event or the network metric was being happening. Next slide, please. This document already has been shown in the last IETF, just to remind you. So it's about adding in the subscription of Young Push the capability of subscribing not only to a NextPass, but specifically to a revision or a revision label in the XPass, and then in the subscription state change notification message also extend the message with the revision and revision label, so that we are understanding not only the context of the subscription ID towards the XPass or the subtree filter, but also to which revision and revision label this belongs to. Next slide, please. So we did some modifications on the draft document. Based on Jason and Rob's feedback, we moved the revision and revision label from the push update to the subscription start and subscription modified. subscription state change notification so that we can reduce the overhead in the messages. We added the Yang full tree view in section 412. And we have one opening item, feedback from Feng Zhong and from Rob regarding when we subscribe to a specific XPath and the revision, that Yang module can have other Yang models being it augments other Yang models. And when a software upgrade occurs on the network node, these augmented Yang models, the revision could change, and how we are addressing this with this draft. Next slide, please. So do you realize the gaps and how it can be resolved? Any thoughts and comments? And one remark, we have on Wednesday, on March 29th, between 12 and 12:45 in room G301, a side meeting where we also give the context on the Apache Kafka side, how we are bringing natively into the schema registry, into the data mesh.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I've chatted to you quite a lot about this work in various places, and you also presented into IEPG on Saturday, Sunday. And so I think for me, I think this is good, useful, important work. I think it's really helpful to be sort of trailblazing in terms of how you get the data off the device and get it into the sort of data systems and manage that. So I think this is good work. I think it's interesting work. So please carry on. Please carry on, bring it here. So
thanks.
Joe Clark, Cisco. I'm struggling with maybe I need a concrete example of observed time versus observed state change versus event time. Reading the draft, you have like two different descriptions of what observed time is. And I'm very confused on what I would do with the three of them. For example, maybe I'm reading an old version, but the Yang description in the module, let's explore that. It says for observed time, if I get this right, this is the time when metrics started counting. Mm-hmm. And then for observe state change observation time, this is the time when the event happened, which to me is the event time. So I would love a very concrete example of this. The device will put this timestamp for this thing, this timestamp for that thing, and this other timestamp for this other thing. And that might help me better understand how I would use that data or those data.
I think the main point is it depends on the type of the subscription. So periodical subscriptions, let's assume like you're exporting every 60 seconds. Okay. So it's the point where you actually do obtain the information from the Yang data store.
Which one is?
That's maybe can we go back on the slide where we describe one more back. So that's the observation time. Okay. So that only applies for the periodical subscription, while the state change observation time only applies on change subscription. Okay. And on change means basically the state change observation time is when the network event happened. Okay. So for instance, when the state change is happening on the interface, right? But we have to distinguish there between on change subscriptions and on change subscription with sync on start. So when we do sync on start, it means basically that we want to give the initial state information from the networking device. So for instance, if that interface came up 2 weeks ago, we need to be able to give this information that on the initial state that it came up 2 weeks ago.
That makes sense. I guess what I'm just, maybe my ultimate comment is having more of that in the draft and maybe
Sure.
shoring up some of these descriptions would help me crystallize that a little bit better than what I was trying to grok reading it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Benoit Claes. So because it's a lot of drafts here, it's presented as a single set. However, there were specific questions like workgroup adoption. And I'm not sure if you want to address this and how we proceed. Because the fact that Thomas present all the draft together, it's like people like the idea, but in the end, we need to get, progressive documents. So in one of the slides, for example, the easy one about the Yang model, it's such an obvious one to me that we should just adopt it and that's it. So maybe there are questions for the chairs here.
Right. And I think in general, one of the questions I did want to ask was, were these drafts discussed on the mailing list before you brought them to the working group? I don't know, and maybe one of the things we could poll, at least in the room, or maybe we could put a poll up, is how many people have even read any of the drafts?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe, Kent, if you want to start a poll to see how many people have read any of the drafts. Okay. No, actually, we do have numbers. Okay, so we do have a fair number of people who have read the draft, but I equal share that I have not, of course, because I believe they came in pretty late or just before 116. To Benoit's point, maybe the question would be for the simple draft, which is adding a timestamp, a Yang module with a timestamp. If that draft is something we believe, okay, is something we want to adopt at this point, or at least ask a poll to find out if there's interest in adopting it.
Which I think that's Rob Wilton. I think that's all fine. I think I'd be interested in a poll to see if people are interested in this work in terms of this useful. And just emphasize, I think when operators are coming here and saying, we've got this problem we're trying to solve, I think that's brilliant for the IETF, because I think getting more operator input, certainly in the ops area, into these are the problems and this is how we want to, can you help us solve these? I think that's great. So.
Okay. We seem to have a fair amount of support for it, so good. Now, in terms of sequencing and figuring out which one we want to adopt right away, which ones we want probably have a little more time for discussion, I want to say maybe the easy one to start off with is the Yang module with a single entry for Yang timestamp, and maybe but defer the others, let people have time to look at them. Maybe. Perfect. So we'll do that officially, of course, on the mailing list, the adoption call.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
in the final presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Qin Wu. The topic I want to introduce is the incident management for network service. This is the OPSA WG draft. So we came here to present to solicit feedback. And yeah, next. And why we want to propose this work. So as we know, we already have alarm management, performance management in some distributed system. We have trace information. We can, use this trace information to do the troubleshooting. And in some sense, actually the frequency and quantity of the alarm and the KPI grow exponentially. So this is really overwhelming the management system for the OSS. Actually, for example, you may have some traditional alarm actually linked to some similar fault, but they may generate multiple troubleshooting tickets. So we call the duplicate tickets. And when you deal with massive alarm or KPI, this kind of information may result in a low processing efficiency. And for alarm and KPI, you can get all this data as a raw data and export to the OSS, and OSS maybe rely on some some kind of expertise, experience, or some and pre-configured policy rules to to identify the root cause. In some sense, actually, is not accurate. So another case, we have we connect the performance data, we connect the alarm or fault data and trace information. They actually built as a silo, and we cannot, provide the end-to-end visibility. And in some cases, actually, you need to explore or investigate some of faults. This maybe depends on some other data, such as the topology data or performance data. So in these cases, it's very difficult to assess the impact of alarm or a metric on the service. So this is something we really want to solve in this draft. So next. So we actually propose some new network maintenance technology. We call it incident management technology. And the incident here actually, is different from the alarm or some other. Actually, we gave the definition. This really, come from the TMF specification. Actually, this incident is, the unexpected interruption of the network service, and also, cover like a degradation of the network service quality or health of the network service. So our idea is really, aggregate, alarm information, KPI information, and other maintenance information, and we can provide consistent management for different type of data source. And in addition, we really need to, identify the relationship between the network service and the incident. So we actually have two ways to do this. Actually, one is, pre-configure the relationship between the incident and network service. Actually, maybe we can reference some of service assurance work, and they, based on that, we can, infer this kind of relationship. And the second one is you may rely on some, artificial intelligence or machine learning mechanism. You do perform some kind of service impact analysis, so you can really, decide actually which incident really, affect the service. So you can automatically or dynamically to establish the relationship between the incident and the network service. So in addition, actually, we propose some kind of troubleshooting API or troubleshooting RPC. So you have these kind of tools. These can initiate some of, multi-step troubleshooting. So this will provide, better root cause analysis, and you can help you to identify the root cause. So we actually propose some of the, troubleshooting RPC, like incident reporting or query, or incident diagnosis or incident resolution. So this is the overview of the work, and the detail, the model design we didn't present here, and we will present in NetMod, also OPSWG as well, so to give the detail. And next. Also, actually, I want to highlight several use cases. Actually, this is we have 4 use cases. Actually, you can see the first 2 use cases actually really, relate to the VPN service troubleshooting. Actually, when you get a VPN deployed and you really need to, do the troubleshooting for the VPN service, and so here we give these 2 use cases very similar. Actually, you need to pre-configure the relationship between the network service and the incident. So you will see actually in both cases actually the network service actually is a VPN-A instance actually, and the network incident is can be the VPN-A unavailable or VPN-A degradation. So we can based on this actually we can decide actually whether we report the incident to the OSS, and based on whether they really affect the service or impact the user experience. So the other use cases actually in the third cases actually we may rely on some machine learning mechanism to perform the service impact analysis, and so we can dynamically establish the relationship between the network service and the incident. Mahesh?
Well, I didn't want to stop your presentation. If you
Okay.
want to finish it, then
Yeah.
I ask my question.
So the last use cases actually, in some cases you may consider, surprise summer incident. This kind of incident is kind of, false incident because, for example, during the cutover stage, actually, this is not really the incident. So you may label this kind of incident or suppress this kind of incident. And in some other cases, for example, you want to, consider the energy saving for some network device to make the network device, sleep in the night. So in this stage, actually, you need to suppress this kind of incident. So you need to label this kind of incident and prevent this kind of false incident to be reported to the OSS or upper layer. So next. So also we clarify the relationship between the incident alarm and performance information. Actually, you can see this figure. We have 3 different layers. We have OSS layer, we have domain controller layer, we have network layer. So on top of the OSS, you will receive the service request. So we will link, different requests to the maybe same incident. And in the southbound or north controller, you can connect, various different data source data like performance data, alarm data. So you can take, these different data source data and as an input. So this will decide whether you will trigger to report an incident based on whether service get affected. So I like stop here. Yeah, that's all.
All right. As a contributor, one of my questions was, you started the presentation with talking about incident reporting and duplication of incidents and all. Considering the previous presentations we just had on timestamping and source of where the particular event is coming from, do you think it would be helpful to kind of take a look at those drafts to see maybe if they resolve some of the questions that you have with respect to how to deal with duplicate incidents?
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. That's why we come here, because this working group, target to the trace information troubleshooting, and we think maybe incident could be linked to this kind of trace information, but we haven't explored yet. But I think it will be interesting to, start to look at it, and happy to raise the discussion on this to take to the list about this. Yeah.
Hi, Chin. I've got Rob Wilton. I've got a couple of questions or comments. So one is, have you compared this work to the SANE architecture and see how that fits in? Because it feels like some of this it's not exactly the same, but it's sort of quite close. That's trying to do the same thing of aggregating different sort of signals of what's happening in the network to aggregate that into meaningful, useful information that you can then act on. So I think it'd be good to understand how that fits in. The other one is obviously the DLMO draft in Ops AWG has incident management in there. So how does this compare to that? Is this trying to just abstract and take it out, or is this something different in terms of what it's trying to do and achieve? And then the last one, I think, is that there's a comment about using machine learning, and putting aside ChatGPT that's doing great things. I think that Thomas was talking about that they had looked at machine learning and found that wasn't that effective. And again, it may have moved on, but I always get slightly worried when I see machine learning or AI in these things, because I think sometimes it's a bit overhyped. That's my view.
Yeah. We may have some concern around this machine learning, but in NMRG they start to explore some AI ops challenges. So this may be a good opportunity. Still, this kind of promising, ChatGPT and these kind of things could really help, reduce the pressure on the management system. So we need to really maybe be cautious about this, but we need to also explore the benefit, or also to try to avoid any some of the downside. So yeah. Hi, Thomas.
Thomas Graf from Swisscom. So first of all, thanks a lot for this work, and I think it's very valuable, and also I think it's very good that it's building on top of the existing Yang model on alarm eventing. So I think that's very valuable. And to answer one of the questions, I've been reviewing the draft, and I see basically the work I've been introducing before. It's actually aligning well what you're presenting in here. I'm basically adding additional metadata so that basically the network device can be better identified, and also adding better time stamping, basically where the observation time of the network is being described. So I think it works very well together. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We can talk more, take offline. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
The next speaker, I just wanted to say, you're not in the queue. It would be, go ahead and identify yourself, and then go ahead and ask.
Sorry.
It's okay. You can go ahead if you're not logged in, but I just didn't see you in the queue.
I just need to press. Sorry, I had it here. Well, I can do it just later. Sorry. Oscar González, Telefónica. I wanted to ask you one question. If you are considering in this work that also in the own network devices, they participate also in this incident management, so the own devices can do some sort of health operations or some, and that they, instead of just reporting as they are now, reporting alarms when some threshold is crossed or something like that, or just performance information, if you are thinking in also new structures to report this abnormal operation as based off of some health check also in the device, also versus everything that you seem to do, the incident management, everything in the controller layer, aggregating thing.
Okay, good suggestion. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
No.
If not, that was the last presentation, and we are at the end of the NetConf agendas. Open mic at this point.
Rob Wilton. So I just want to make a comment on the client server suite of drafts that I'm reviewing. So I've sent comments on 2 of those drafts to the list. I think I've probably reviewed about another 4 of them, so I've got comments to write up and send them. So hopefully that will happen, probably not this week, maybe not next week, but sometime soon. So I'm getting through those. I think one of the key questions that's come up there, though, when I was reviewing those, was about how we handle these keys that are built into the device and how we represent or reference those from the configuration. So I've sort of punted that issue to the net mod alias and on the sort of system data store draft and also NMDA, because I think there's some interesting questions there. But if you want to track that might be an interesting conversation to see how that resolves. But I think we need to find a way that we can use these keys effectively without necessarily having to copy them in or something.
All right. Any other comments, questions? All right. If not, with that, we end the NetConf working group session. Thank you for coming. See you all in San Francisco.